we have a phrase in what Willie calls zoology, now called bees. And today's lump of shite is tomorrow's PhD, or is it the other way around? We'll be looking for volunteers at the end of the talk to go and find otter shite in Cork City. We've got a project looking at otter biodiversity in Cork City. And these days, if you get the shite, you can extract the DNA. And we now know that we have 6 otters in Cork City. We have males, we have females, and we have a female with a mutation on her second sex chromosome, which is very exciting and interesting. We've never found this mutation before. And when we met yesterday to discuss this, one of the wags from Cork City said she'd probably be very good at the Olympics. Anyway, I'm going to talk about biodiversity and infectious diseases. Last autumn, Photo Wildlife Park asked me to go to Jersey, the Durrell Institute in Jersey, on a course called Emerging Diseases and Conservation. And what follows from this course is what I present tonight. Emerging diseases are a great threat to the world, to agriculture, to conservation. But there is a flip side to that, which is that if you have intact biodiversity, particularly enriched biodiversity, it seems to diminish the rate of infectious disease, and that's quite an important and interesting finding. So we have biodiversity, that's all the diversity on Earth, most of it microorganisms. It's what we rely on for in health and for ecosystem function. And in Ireland, we have a very specific and interesting occurrence of biodiversity. We then have infectious diseases. These threaten our very existence, particularly when they threaten agriculture. And we have a previous experience of this here in Ireland during the Great Famine. And finally, we've got the mixture of the two. How do the two things interact? How does biodiversity, particularly enriched biodiversity, interact with infectious diseases? The illustration here is a very fine photograph taken of 5 adult badgers at the side of the road, the side of the N11 in Wicklow, where we've been studying the badgers and the straightening of the road south of Wicklow town. It was taken by Mick Jagger, who designed most of the lecture. So we start with biodiversity in Ireland. People think of biodiversity, when they think of biodiversity, they think of the tropics, they think of Africa, they think of Madagascar. But in fact, we have a very rich biodiversity here in Ireland, most of it migratory in terms of salmonids going to our rivers or birds flying into our wetlands. We've also got a very, very rich marine biodiversity, and I'll come back to that towards the end of the lecture. We have a very rich marine biodiversity that, if it's accessed by animals, probably enhances their health outcomes. We've also got a very rich genetic biodiversity, by which I mean that there's a wide range of DNA within Irish organisms that reflects an isolation during the last glaciation. Biodiversity and ecosystem services are hugely undervalued in Ireland. Cathy Maguire of the Sustainable Development Council described this in a recent leaflet. We don't value our biodiversity enough. We don't value it sufficiently. And this was particularly shown during the Celtic Tiger period, where places were developed with a view, not a view to biodiversity. And we have a large number of native land animals that were isolated at the end of the last glaciation. The hairy wood ant, the frog, natterjack toad, Lyser's bat, the badger, the Irish stoat, the Irish hare, the Irish otter, the red squirrel and the wood mouse. These are all now regarded as native animals. At one time they were regarded as introductions. I'll take one of them just as an illustration. That's the Lyser's bat. This is a very big bat, highly migratory, and it occurs only in 3 places in the world. It occurs in the Azores, Ireland, commonly, and in Iran. And the Irish population and the Azorean population, we now know from DNA studies, are related to each other. So the refugium that the Lyser's bat occurred in was wooded and connected both Ireland and the Azores. Then you wonder what's Iran, Ireland, and the Azores have in common habitat-wise. Somebody suggested that it was intolerant religious republics. That was the habitat, the Lyser's bat. Okay, so we look at biodiversity hotspots worldwide, and you can see that there's a hotspot in the western southern United States, Central America, the Caribbean, Western South America, Central Eastern South America, around the Mediterranean, Turkey, Iraq, down the Horn of Africa, the Fenbus in southern Africa, Madagascar, and then a series of islands and the mainland of Indochina, plus eastern Australia. I want you to try and recall this map, because one would predict from this map, if these areas had very high biodiversity, that this is where emerging diseases would emerge from. But in fact, that's not the pattern that we observe. We observe emerging diseases coming from other places, from places that are not rich in biodiversity. So that's the first important thing I have to say. Biodiversity includes all life forms. Most of the microbes do not do any damage. Most of the microbes occur in ecosystem function, but do not cause disease. This guy is the American E.O. Wilson, who wrote the book on biodiversity. But biodiversity is best accessed actually by the 1999 National Geographic on the topic, the fragile web. And we all have a responsibility to maintain biodiversity worldwide. This is the -4 Kew Gardens seed bank. There's efforts worldwide to try and preserve biodiversity, which are failing. We've been failing to reach these goals. And if we fail fundamentally to reach these goals in the future, we'd probably endanger our health. That would be the concluding remark I'd have from tonight's talk. There are perhaps 10 million, perhaps 100 million species. We're not even sure how many there are in biodiversity. It's declining faster than any time in the past. Now, bearing in mind what I'm saying about diseases and biodiversity, we ought to avoid contact with wild animals. We ought not to put them in zoos or wildlife parks like they are in FOTA. We ought to avoid primates and bats, and we ought to avoid hospitals. We should avoid all these things, but of course human beings aren't made like that. Human beings will gather wild animals together, human beings will go and study bats, and they will interact with primates, but these things exacerbate the emerging disease phenomenon. So now moving to infectious diseases. Infectious diseases have played a far bigger role in our history than any other phenomenon. And this has been pointed out by a number of authors, most famously by William McNeill, the prof of history in the University of Chicago, who in his 1960s book, Plagues and Peoples, pointed out that history was actually a history of diseases, not a history of armies or kings. And one of his best examples was the rate of infectious diseases among Napoleon's troops on the retreat from Moscow, where he pointed out succinctly that it wasn't the Russians that defeated Napoleon's troops, it was actually infectious diseases. Then Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, the man who set up the PSNI, has written a very good book called What Next? Surviving the 21st Century. And he points out in the book that diseases are of central importance to history, particularly modern European history, and that European nation states evolved because they had an ability to defend their citizens against infectious diseases when they introduced quarantine. If you like, what he's trying to say is that ecosystems, the ultimate ecosystem is health, and the ultimate state-supplied ecosystem service is health. One of the best examples of this phenomenon is the breakdown of feudalism and the influence of Black Death. My 8-year-old, the other day, we were chatting about doing this lecture tonight, and he said, "Dad, were you around when there was Black Death?" Anyway, during the Black Death, because so many people died in Europe, wages went up, and wages were tried to be fixed by the statutes of labourers. There was selection for low Van Willebrand factor. It was a coastal disease, and it's partially responsible, for example, for the decline of Spain as a great power. It was an important prelude to the Reformation. It rocked the religion in its core. It was a direct cause of the enclosures of lands in these islands and the initial success of European settlement in North America. And I'll go on about that a little later on. And it's now considered by the World Health Organization to be a re-emerging disease. And had a huge impact here in Ireland. It stopped the Anglo-Norman advance in its tracks. And there have been 2 very good books by Maria Kelly on the occurrence of bubonic plague in Ireland and its historical effects. The one I like best is the occurrence of tower houses, which are these large fortified houses that occur across Ireland and are unique to Ireland and the west of Scotland. And they're particularly dominant across the middle of the country, If you imagine going up the main road from Cork to Dublin, you come across a lot of tower houses, one after the other. This is because the Anglo-Norman advance stopped at that point, and then the pastoralists, Gaelic lords, and the Anglo-Normans both built tower houses either side of that frontier. This was influenced by the Bruce invasion from Scotland. It was introduced. It was also a factor because the Anglo-Normans had suffered predominantly from bubonic plague because they were mainly urban people, and urban people get bubonic plague easier than pastoralists. That's why the Anglo-Norman advance was stopped. So it's nice and interesting to think that tower houses are actually a reflection of bubonic plague rather than a historical artifact. And of course, we had the huge and very spectacular abandonment of the rural Ireland after the famine. These are lazy beds in Clare Island in County Mayo, and this is the human population from 1841 to 1871, going up to 8 million people and then rapidly declining, not only because of the blight in the potatoes, but declining because people didn't die of starvation, they died of typhoid fever. That's an important thing to remember when we come to interpret some of the later parts of this talk, remembering that there was this huge population bulge in the middle of the 19th century. And the people that died in that famine were people who lived on the lumper potato. So there are potato varieties that are resistant to blight, and the people who cultivated potatoes to begin with in South America understood this and kept the genetic biodiversity of their potatoes enriched by keeping wild-type potatoes alive at the edge of their potato fields. It was only when the whole thing became a monoculture in Ireland of singular varieties of potatoes that the disease caught hold and died of. So it's a very good example of low biodiversity causing a disease and causing a human catastrophe. And there are other effects of disease that are not popularly understood. Probably one of the most important ones from the point of view of politics in Ireland was the 1912, the early 1900s, 1912 epidemic of foot-and-mouth. This was a serious trade imbalance between Britain and Ireland. Foot-and-mouth had become a notifiable disease in the late 19th century. The Irish Veterinary Department thought they could control the disease. This was rejected by the British Department of Health, and there was a huge political fallout between both islands over this, the way foot-and-mouth was handled in that epizootic. And this is thought to have led to the movement for an independent Ireland. So the foot-and-mouth epidemic seems to have triggered a political event. But much more serious, much more long-lasting, and hugely important in terms of world history is the effect of diseases on Amerindian populations in both North and South America. Because they didn't have draft animals, because they didn't have pigs, horses, sheep, and cattle, the Amerindians were not exposed to a lot of infectious diseases that we have in Europe that are commonplace. This is one example of the decline of the populations of Amerindians in Mexico. In the graph, you can see that we begin in 1518 with a population of 25 million people. By the end of that decline, the population has declined to less than 5 million people. So 20 million people were removed from the population by infectious diseases, which is why Europeans were allowed to predominate in North and South America. So diseases have had a huge effect on human history. Now, this is from the One Health website. One Health is a movement trying to integrate veterinary, medical, and ecological views on diseases, particularly emerging diseases. This is their rather propagandized map of vector-borne diseases worldwide. You can see there's a lot of diseases spread in South America by arthropods. There's more bat diseases across Africa and Southeast Asia. And the hotspots are not particularly predominant in that particular graph, in that particular map. However, if we look at emerging diseases more succinctly, this is from Jones et al. In Nature in 2008, we find the pattern of emerging diseases is not in the same places as we get high biodiversity. If you think back to the map of areas of high biodiversity, so-called high biodiversity hotspots, these are other areas, and the predominant places that emerging diseases are coming from are in eastern North America and Western Europe. And we think this is because there's been a lot of land use changes in these areas and because agriculture has intensified in these areas. That's why we're getting emergent diseases from these places. So biodiversity hotspots and parts of the world that emerging diseases are emerging from are two different separate entities. Some emerging diseases are coming from biodiversity hotspots, but by and large, not the majority. So areas who are rich in biodiversity are not nodes of infectious disease. Well, why is that the case? If you get a large number of diverse microbes, why are diseases not coming out of these areas of rich biodiversity? Well, disease is a conversation between a host, which must be susceptible, and a suitably vectored pathogen. Co-occurrence is just not enough for disease to occur. That conversation needs to flow. And there are a number of mechanisms that we're beginning to understand by which rich biodiversity decreases the risks of infectious disease. So factors such as land use change, agricultural intensification are significant. You can see the graph there. The green indicates land use changes, and the lighter green represents agricultural intensification. You can see that's occurred mainly in eastern North America and Western Europe. And then the human susceptibility to infection, which would be, of course, cancer and AIDS. So I'm going to take two examples of vector dilution. One is of Lyme disease in North America, and one is of liver fluke in Ireland. So we take Lyme disease in North America. This diagram illustrates the two likelihoods of occurrence of Lyme disease. On the left, you've got a rich biodiversity habitat with opossums and about 15 species of mammal. Because the 15 species of mammal groom ticks and are not good vectors of Lyme disease, the number of ticks that get infected, which is represented by the yellow, is very few, so you get virtually no Lyme disease. So in stable, biodiverse rich habitats, there's very little Lyme disease in the ticks. There's some, but there's very little. So if you get a tick, you're not likely to be infected. But in the town of Lyme in Connecticut, people had bulldozed sites in the woodlands to build houses. And by building those houses, they'd reduce the number of wild mammals to very few. And the most predominant of those mammals was the white-footed mouse, which is a generalist mouse, which is a very good vector for Lyme disease and a very good host for the tick. So you got fewer mammals, more ticks, and more of those ticks were infected. And if you see, the infection rate of the ticks is represented in the circle by the yellow. Consequently, people became paralyzed in the town of Lyme by this infectious disease. That's one example where biodiversity richness is quite clearly decreasing the prevalence of disease. More excitingly for us here in Ireland is the story of liver fluke, and this is a hypothesis at the moment. You'll all remember from your Leaving Cert biology that liver fluke needs a snail as an intermediate host. And that snail is a specific species of snail, Lemna truncatata. So you go to a pasture land here in Ireland and you find a lot of snails. There's a rich biodiversity of snails. Our former Prime Minister, Bertie Reynolds, used to criticise the interest in biodiversity by saying that people are only interested in snails and swans. Well, he was awfully wrong, because we have a rich biodiversity of swans coming down from the Arctic in a migratory pattern, and we have a rich biodiversity of snails. That's very important. So it was kind of an ignorant remark about biodiversity. That biodiversity of snails might well be the solution to our liver fluke problem. If you have a high biodiversity of snails, and the liver fluke is trying to find Lemna, the specific species it wants as an intermediate host, it gets confused because it can't find the right species. So high biodiversity of snails could well lead to a significant reduction in liver fluke. That's one example, again, of biodiversity richness decreasing exposure to disease. The effects of biodiversity on disease transmission: first of all, you get fewer hosts, fewer species of hosts, leading to simpler transmission. We had that example of Lyme disease. You could also get an example from snails in Ireland. The most diverse communities confuse pathogen life cycles. They often end up in the wrong host. So the richer the number of hosts, the more likely the pathogen is to end up in the wrong host. Higher genetic diversity means that hosts may often be resistant. This is typical of rice and fungus in China, for example. In other words, complexity is bad for disease transmission. Simplicity is good. So I'll take some general examples now from the tropics. From the country called Gabon in West Africa. This is a country that has an exemplary biodiversity record. They have primates in most of their coastal forests survive. They've got some of the best national parks in that part of Africa. They've also got Ebola. They've got the normal mosquito-borne diseases, including malaria. And I compare it to the Ivory Coast, further up the coast, which has a horrific record of environmental degradation. And then the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean, and I compare that to Haiti. Haiti has a very poor record of biodiversity conservation. There's virtually no trees left in Haiti, whereas the Dominican Republic, despite being a fascist dictatorship for many years, has a very good record of biodiversity conservation. And finally, I go on about some recent work that was done in northwestern Madagascar to do with people who eat bushmeat. And this is a central topic to the end of the talk. So this is a gorgeous picture of coastal Gabon. How come my photographs never end up like that? I mean, it's a brilliant photograph from National Geographic, and it shows the coastal forest reaching to the sea in Gabon. There'd be about 15 species of primate in that forest. In comparison to Gabon, Ivory Coast between 1997 and 1987 lost 42% of its forests. So it's the highest rate of loss of forest in the world. So in biodiversity terms, Ivory Coast is a basket case. Gabon is quite a good example of good biodiversity practice. This is the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Here you can see the Dominican Republic is still green and Haiti is brown because of the erosion. So if we look at the rate of clinical burden of malaria in these countries, and if you look carefully where Gabon is and where the Ivory Coast is, you can see there's virtually no malaria in Gabon. There's a huge amount in Ivory Coast. And if you look at the Dominican Republic and Haiti, you'll see Haiti is green and the Dominican Republic is yellow. So there's a lot of malaria in Haiti, but very little in the Dominican Republic. We hypothesize, this is still a hypothesis, that in Gabon, the malaria mosquitoes find other primates apart from people to feed on, and that's why there's so little malaria. Whereas in Ivory Coast, there are no primates left for the mosquitoes to find. There's only one primate around, that's people. And the same is probably true in the Dominican Republic. This is a huge implication if we think about medicine, veterinary, and biodiversity. If you can maintain biodiversity, you can bring down your health bills, which are a huge cost to society at present. So biodiversity budgets and health budgets might well be interlinked in the future. There's also, and this is a scarier aspect of the whole thing, the benefits of wildlife consumption. There's been a recent paper published by Americans from Harvard and Berkeley in California. And they looked at a protected area in northeastern Madagascar called Macari. They took 105 households. They got their informed consent, and they visited once a month, and they inspected the stews that the family were having, and they inspected the bloods of under 12-year-olds, pre-adolescent children. And they studied these families over several years. They inspected the stews that these people were eating. I've eaten a few Malagasy stews in my time, and studying them was well worth it. It's a PhD project, really, because anything goes into a Malagasy stew. But they were particularly interested in the presence of wild animals in those stews. And they concluded that if there were no wild animals available to these people, from studying people who consumed wildlife and didn't consume wildlife, there would be 29% increase in anemia in these children. Now, childhood anemia leads to adult illnesses. So this is a very important conclusion from a protected area. In other words, those Malagasy that were breaking the protection laws on wild animals, killing wild animals, eating the bushmeat, were better protected against diseases and had better cognitive outcomes than those that didn't eat the wild animals. So we've been telling the Malagasy the wrong thing for many years. We've been telling them not to consume lemurs. What we should have been doing was telling them to consume lemurs, but do it at a sustainable level. And I suspect this study will become an archetype study that will be transferred to other parts of Africa, and we'll find that the consumption of bushmeat is actually very important for people's health. That's a difficult one to sell to the conservation community, but it's a very important one. Okay, we go on to my favourite topic here. As Willie pointed out, I'm very interested in badgers, and I'm very interested in tuberculosis. And there are a number of people, a few people here tonight who work with me on those projects. This is a great practical achievement, an achievement that was only possible as a result of the Good Friday Agreement that stipulated that both parts of Ireland should cooperate on animal disease control. A no-brainer, but we hadn't done it up to then. And this is the first united map, collaboration north-south, of bovine tuberculosis in cattle. You can see it there pixelated on the left, and then you can see it roughly drawn out with better illustration on the right. And you can see there are concentrations of bovine tuberculosis in cattle, north-south. And here we have it spelt out over several years, 1996, 1998, through to 2006. And you can see that the front of bovine tuberculosis in cattle moves. And this is still a disease that spills over to people. This is a fragmented farm in County Wexford. The badger sets are those yellow squares around the farm. You've got fragment 1, fragment 2, fragment 3, and fragment 4. Controlling animal diseases in Ireland is a huge problem because farms are all fragmented. So you're dealing with a fragmented herd to begin with, and you're also dealing with a significant wildlife problem in that mainland populations of badgers often have prevalences of 20 to 40% of tuberculosis. So it's a very significant issue because you have this animal that has a high prevalence of tuberculosis that's also a protected animal and of ecological importance. About 10,000 years ago, we calculate that there were about 3,000 badgers in Ireland. Now there are about 70,000, 20 to 40% of which have TB. So this is a significant problem. If you think back to when the population was high in the mid-19th century, there probably were very few badgers because there was no room for badgers. If we then look at the growth of cattle in Ireland, you'll find that there was a steep rise from about 1950 through to about 1980. The numbers of cattle went up from about 6,000 to about 9,000 very rapidly just before we joined the EU. And we suspect the steady rise in cattle led to an increase in badgers to that 70,000 mark. And at some point in that graph, probably in the late 60s, those badgers got TB from those cattle and they started to transmit back into the herd. At least that's what we think happened. So if we look at Irish badger populations of interest, I've just put on the forested cover for the Republic there, and I've illustrated a number of islands where we've studied badgers. 2 islands off Donegal, Rutland and Inishku, Coney Island off Sligo, Phoenix Island off Kerry, Great Island here in Cork Harbour, and Little Island in Waterford. Now if you think about those populations, they're on islands, therefore they have to access marine food. So if you think about the badgers in the highly intensive cattle areas, they've got a rate of tuberculosis of between 20 to 40%. In less intense areas, the prevalence is lower, probably because they have a biodiversity richer diet, although less biomass, more biodiversity in less intensive areas. But on the islands, and this is the kind of a difficult thing to get your head around, they have a biodiversity very rich diet because they eat marine organisms. And we have never recovered TB in any of the island badger populations, which is suggesting that there might be a dietary cause to the problem. There's been studies of badger diet, and we found that Irish badgers by and large eat earthworms, beetles, frogs, and invertebrates associated with improved pasture. However, I think that if we've expanded this dietary study to include areas of intensive cattle rearing, not intensive cattle rearing, and then the islands, we get a much more interesting view of the role of diet in tuberculosis in badgers. So the implications. In the last so many years, a black man has been elected as president of the United States. A friend of mine in the United States emailed me the next day saying, "Thank God I can travel abroad and not pretend to be Canadian." We've also had the Arab Spring. The whole Middle East has revolutionized and has thrown off the yoke of dictatorship. But we have yet really to grapple with the bigger issues of health. We've yet to integrate health into an ecosystem understanding of what it means. There is a relationship between biodiversity and infectious diseases. Often it's both genetic biodiversity and species biodiversity that lowers the rates of infections. There's a number of mechanisms for this, but it's certainly not fully understood. And I think we need what's called a One Health approach to this problem. And the One Health mission statement is recognizing that human health, including mental health and human and animal bound phenomenon, animal health, ecosystem health are inextricably linked. One Health seeks to promote, improve and defend the health and well-being of all species by enhancing cooperation and collaboration between physicians, veterinarians, other scientific and environmental professionals by promoting strength in leadership and management to achieve these goals. I think it's important. Health is too important to be left to a single discipline. It needs to be a multidisciplinary approach, and I think the One Health initiative is a good step on the way to this. As usual, I provided references. For those of you who'd like to read up about this, the references are attached and printed out down here. And I have a number of ads. We have an island ecology course for those of you who are interested in Cape Clear during the summer. We'll be publishing a book, Fauna Hibernica, in 2013. We already published a book, Irish Wild Mammals, A Guide to Literature, and we're looking for people to collect otter shite. Thank you for listening to me.